Hi, everybody, and welcome to the May episode of the Advocacy and Policy podcast here from Arnold and Porter. I'm Kevin O'Neill. I'm joined by my partners and colleagues, Sonia Nesbitt, former member of Congress Ron Kind, and Mark Epley. We're going to be talking about two things today. We're 6 months out from the elections. We're going to be talking about all the implications, where things stand, and then we're going to get deep dive into the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, where that's going. It's up for reauthorization next year, and what people should be doing to get prepared for that now. But let's start with election 2024. As we sit here recording this, we're basically 180 days out from the election, as people are fond of saying, the most consequential election of our lifetime, right? And we've got a real cliffhanger, both for the White House, the Senate, and the House. Sort of all potential outcomes are on the table. And I want to start with you, Ron, because you're the guy who spent decades running, knowing what it takes to win, and knowing what it's like to be in a majority and a minority. So I want to start with you and Sonia and ask, what are the three policy issues that motivate Democrats to get to the polls in November as we stand here today?
It's an election year? It is an election year. Buckle up and hang on, especially for those in swing states, because that's where all the attention obviously is going to go. Who's going to control the electoral?
Wisconsin's a swing state.
Wisconsin's a swing state. And I lived that life for many, many years, and it's going to be a wild one back home. But yeah, I think, both sides have some challenges as far as their election turnout and what they're trying to achieve, starting with President Biden. Clearly, he's got to motivate his base. He's got to consolidate that, and he's got to deal with the youth issue right now, which has been problematic. And how do you encourage them to get out and participate? But, the main issues that they've been emphasizing so far has been kind of the economic revitalization plan that they've been pursuing for the last 4 years, and whether it's taking hold in the United States and making a difference in people's lives. It's protection of democracy and all the values that come with it. And also the Dobbs decision still resonates loud and clear, especially now that you got various state courts intervening, various state legislatures and governors establishing very restrictive laws, obviously Florida being front and center in today's news. So those are going to be some of the themes that they're going to continue to punch and emphasize going into the summer and fall campaign.
So Sonia, he says economy, protect democracy, Dobbs. Those are the three motivating things. Do you agree, or are there other things you think get Dems out to the polls?
No, it's always a challenge with going after the congressman, because he always takes all the good answers. But I agree. Those are the top three as well. I mean, just to elaborate just a little bit, I mean, first with the student issue, I mean, the protests on college campuses are beginning to obviously spread in a way that I don't think anyone can anticipate. So grappling with that issue and how it might impact the youth vote and motivate the youth vote is something that I think certainly the administration should and probably already are thinking very heavily about. It's always the economy. Who was it? Who said it's the economy, stupid, right? It's always, Carville. But it gets down to that. I mean, I think, if you look at, reading something this morning, talk about consumer sentiment from the CEO's perspective of a variety of business leaders, and spending is beginning to slow down. Gas prices are still a little too high for folks, and we all can go to the grocery store and see the impact that inflation is having on the cost of groceries. So I think certainly getting a handle on that and motivating people to understand that the economy is not terrible, it's actually doing well. But, there are still some challenges. It's going to be key. And obviously, the reproductive rights fight is absolutely vital and something that the Democrats are taking head on.
So, Mark, let me bring you in here. What do you think are the three issues that animate Republican voters to turn out or that the elected officials are pushing as their big issues for the fall?
Sure. The two, the economy, for sure. Are you better now than you were? The second is sort of immigration, border security. And then the third, I'm not sure where that lands, Kevin. It could be public safety more generally. Typically, foreign affairs are not things that come into voters' considerations, at least in terms of motivation. But it is the fact that there is significant strife and unrest in a couple big places in the world, in Ukraine and in Israel. So it's unclear whether those things break through. What's very interesting about this particular presidential matchup is this is actually an apples to apples comparison. You never have a situation wherein you've got someone who's done the job, and you can compare it against another who's done the job. So it'll be interesting to see what that third thing breaks through. But I think clearly the economy, immigration, border security.
Yeah, I think that third thing right now for Republicans is kind of just culture war, that they feel like they're pushing back against Biden and the broader, I'm using air quotes here, left on culture war issues, and Dobbs' abortion is sort of a piece of that. I think that animates Democrats more than Republicans. In a sense, Republicans got what they wanted out of the Supreme Court. This was returned to the states, and the irony is, in returning it to the states, with the exception of Florida, Democrats are winning the argument at the state level. They're getting policies closer to what they want, and it's still driving turnout for the election and ballot things. So, Mark, you talked about this is the extraordinary election where we have two people who have done the job. First time in our lifetime that we face that. So let's talk about, what does Joe Biden need to win? What does Donald Trump need to win? And we'll start again with the incumbent. What does President Biden need to get 4 more years?
Well, I think one of the great X factors in this race is former President Trump's legal woes and how that plays out. Obviously, you have the case pending in New York right now, which will reach a verdict at some point early this summer, we suspect. The other case is a little less likely to be heard and tried before the election. But just the fact that he's in court every day, having to sit as a defendant and not on the campaign trail, it's bound to have an effect. But I think as far as President Biden is concerned, he's really got to get back to that coalition he formed 4 years ago and what it's going to take to bring them together and motivate them to show up and vote. And one of the great unknowns is the youth vote right now, which has slipped. Sonia, you mentioned the strife in Gaza and the impact that's having on campuses. I know through history that whenever there's that type of strife and chaos and uncertainty, people tend to gravitate more towards a strong man type of leadership style to crack down on those protests. And whether that plays out through the summer remains to be seen.
Ironically, the last time the Democratic Convention was in Chicago, 1968, and riots there basically destroyed the narrative and probably contributed to a massive runaway victory for a strongman Republican candidate.
I think both cities are kind of bracing. Obviously, you got the Republican Convention in Milwaukee, in my home state of Wisconsin this year. I think they're taking some extra security precautions. And then Chicago, 68, anyone who knows the history there, it didn't work all that well for the Democratic Convention. So I think there is concern going into both conventions, quite frankly.
Sonia, what else do you add about the Biden blueprint of victory?
Just picking up on that, let's hope there are lessons learned from both sides as it relates to coming into the conventions. I think, again, Ron tapped into all of them. I think certainly the youth vote, the turnout is going to be absolutely important, as well as motivating people to think that Biden has the enthusiasm, the stamina, the vision to take them for another 4 years. I mean, I think some of this really is just for him a sort of almost a psychological play for his base, because I think most Democratic voters aren't looking and going, well, maybe Trump is the better option. I think both parties, particularly traditional voters, are in their own camps. Right now, the war is about getting everyone out to vote and feel motivated to vote on election day, because I think turnout's going to be key.
Yeah, we're really talking about the margins here too. In those key swing states, 1-2% could decide the Electoral College and the outcome of the election. So we're just talking about a sliver of the population that can swing this election.
And if I'm not mistaken, what is it, about 81,000, less than 100,000 folks in pure numbers decided the election the last time around.
Yeah. I think both Bush elections and both of the last two, the Obama didn't have those close calls, but the last two, if you had switched 100,000 votes for the last 6 presidential elections, you'd have had a different outcome. So, Mark, let's swing it to you. Donald Trump, Ron says he's sitting in a courtroom. He's not on the campaign trail. What does he need to have a blueprint to victory?
So one thing that's curious is how public opinion comes to be made and how it comes to settle. CNN recently had a poll asking, do you view Trump presidency as being successful? Yay, nay. I think it was 55% successful, 45% unsuccessful. Do you think Biden's administration has been successful, unsuccessful? Maybe it was 61% unsuccessful and 33% successful, and maybe I don't know. But along those lines,
And absence made the heart grow fonder, because
Well,
4 years ago the numbers were not good for Trump on that
That's
question.
right. So I think what's curious about this is interesting. The legal challenges that Trump has faced. One, initially he was kicked off Twitter. Now he's allowed back on X, but he's not. He's using his own social media company, Truth Social, which is not as widely used as X is. And now he's subject to a gag order, or the threat of a gag order in his instant trial. Frankly, it's kind of like he all that the voting public is left with is their impressions of the Trump administration and what they remember from it. And some among the things that people did not like about Trump that would nonetheless vote for them was his style. They didn't like his abrasive tweets or those kinds of things, wading into every issue with a pretty strong opinion. That was not well liked or embraced, except for the hardcore group. So interestingly, the fact that he's been silenced, at least right now, has worked in his favor.
Yeah, I'll make a couple observations. One, I think uncertainty and unrest doesn't play well when you're the incumbent in the White House. Didn't help Trump 4 years ago. The George Floyd protests, the sort of COVID shutdown didn't help the incumbent. I don't think what's going on college campuses is helping the incumbent this time around. I actually think that Trump being in the courtroom is not the worst thing for him. One, he's getting millions in earned media every day. And, I'm not sure anybody's opinion changes based on today's news about what comes out of the court. He's actually getting some interesting opportunities to go visit with construction workers in the morning, go stand outside of Columbia, right? I mean, like, New York City's not where you would want him to be necessarily. There's plenty of microphones around for him when he wants to talk, and it actually does curb some of his worst instincts because he's got 8 hours stuck in a courtroom every day. So let's transition because the Senate's sort of the next domino to fall. And generally speaking, over the last 25 years, we've seen much stronger correlation between the White House ticket winner in a state dragging their Senate candidate across the finish line. And there's a lot of these battleground states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where you've got Nevada, where you've got Arizona, high-profile Senate race as well. So talk to us about the key Senate races, how you think that plays into the presidential, and what do you think about the prospects? We'll start with you, Ron.
Yeah, obviously Senate one seat flip and you got a new majority coming in next year. But yeah, there are, again, some key states that are going to be up for grabs. Obviously, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, for instance, Tester in Montana. You got the open seat now in Arizona. Nevada is going to be competitive. And again, these candidates are probably going to have to outperform the top of the ticket, outperform their presidential nominees.
I don't think there's coattails.
No, I think just and these some of the senators have proven to do just that, to outperform the top. Sherrod Brown has consistently done that in Ohio, and Tester in Montana. And I would also throw in Wisconsin, being the purple swing state that it is, although Tammy Baldwin seems to be in a stronger position this time going in, especially the candidate that she's facing. But again, these are going to really come down to the margin, really tight races, and probably late nights or subsequent days waiting for the votes to be counted.
Sonia?
I mean, you summed it up perfectly. It's everyone's sort of biting their nails right now about what can happen in the Senate. Again, I think it gets down to just, the race in Montana. Sherrod Brown has proven time and again he knows how to win in Ohio. So our confidence, a little bit of confidence there, but I certainly think that Montana is a big issue. West Virginia, you forgot to mention that. I mean, that's where Manchin is not running for re-election, and they have a very strong Republican candidate there. And we'll see what happens in Arizona. Obviously, it's going to be a very animated race given the two folks who are running on both sides, but it's going to be a challenge for Democrats.
I notice you don't mention any Republican incumbent senator that you think is at risk. So, like a Florida Rick Scott, you don't see a pickup opportunity anywhere on the map?
So I would like to think that can happen, but I've been in this business for a very long time, and certainly Rick Scott is, vulnerable. You could even say perhaps Ted Cruz could be a little vulnerable here. Whether or not that's enough to take both of those candidates, Alred and the Senate Democrat run-in Florida over the finish line, who knows? I do think it's going to be a very tight race.
The vice president's spending a lot of time in Florida right
She
now
is,
around the
yes.
abortion issue, trying to see if there's
Absolutely.
anything there before they commit to millions this fall. So, Mark, maybe a more favorable map for Republicans in the Senate this time around. What are the races you are focused on that the best chances to pick up occur?
Yeah, one we haven't talked about. I'm really very curious about our Democratic colleagues' views on Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Dave McCormick.
Right. I think that McCormick is viewed as a very high quality candidate, an able contender as against the incumbent Casey, and I'm that's one that I'm watching for sure as a possible Republican pickup. And turn it back to our Democratic colleagues. I'm curious what you think about Pennsylvania.
It's interesting because it might be a carpet-begging issue like Emmett Oz
Right.
faced that might come back and bite McCormick again. That was used very effectively against Oz in the last statewide race. And so he's got some questions to answer there.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of these races, McCormick, a great example. You've got a lot of self-funded candidates, Wisconsin, another where people, the parties can say, well, that candidate can help pay their own way.
One race we haven't talked about, and this is one I think, unfortunately, you guys, as we work together, have heard my deep, dark concerns about this one, is Maryland.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of self-funded candidates, I mean, you have a very competitive primary with Angela Alsobrooks and David Trone. Trone is self-funded candidate. Alsobrooks, more of a broad, recognized leader in Maryland who may have the slight advantage there. But then you also have a very competitive Republican running in, former Governor Larry Hogan. So it'll be very interesting to see how this comes out. Do I think Hogan can beat Alsobrooks? No, but it might be very, very close.
You think he can beat Trone?
I don't know. And I'm not trying to be speculative
Yeah,
here.
I mean, certainly.
I just don't know. It's about what's going to motivate Maryland voters to come out and vote at a high level.
Yeah, it's a fascinating race because he was considered fairly successful in 2 terms
That's
as
right.
a governor. And yet you have to think Biden's going to win by comfortable double digits in Maryland. So, how do you get a couple 100,000 Biden voters to cross the line and vote for you on the other side?
Exactly. And what are those voters? I mean, where do they come from? And that's why I think Alsobrooks has a bit of an advantage.
Yeah, I do agree that that's very much a dark horse race. It seems to me that no matter what, we're still going to be playing in a Senate next year that's at best 52-48 for somebody,
That's right.
probably 51-49. We'll get to what that means for clients here in just a minute. But let's turn next to the House. We're not going to review 435 races, but kind of just talk about trends, and want to start with the guy who ran 13 times in the House and knows what it's like. You've been in the room when you're measuring the curtains and you think you're about to be in the majority. You've been in the room when you've been lamenting the fact that it looks like your majority is about to slip away. Take us into the mindset of what you think the Republican and Democratic conferences are thinking like today.
I think the House Democratic Caucus is a little bit upbeat right now. They're feeling pretty confident that they have enough districts to be competitive and win and get back the majority. Of course, we're talking a 1-2 seat majority right now. So again, it's really at the margins. But it's been interesting because the last couple of election cycles, there has been more separation between Biden at the top of the ticket and these other Democratic office holders running in these competitive districts. And these congressional office races have done pretty well in separating from Biden in his narrative. And I think it gets back to what Sonia was pointing out with Biden's handicap, the age issue, and whether he's up for another 4 years. That doesn't translate into these other races and that. So I think redistricting was pretty much a wash now throughout the country. There wasn't any clear advantage after the various maps were drawn up. But given the quality of candidates out there, I still would give the Ds a slight edge going into this fall.
60-40?
Yeah, maybe a little high 50s around there. Of course, it's still a lifetime between now and November, and so many factors can come into play.
All that is exactly right. And I think most Democrats will quietly say the same thing. And they haven't talked to members, I know, Ron, you probably have as well as Democratic colleagues in the House. They are already thinking about, well, what does that number need to look like if we win, right? We don't want to end up with a margin that's similar to what Republicans have, but it could happen. They need to win by very big numbers in their mind. Of course, big is in the eye of the beholder at this moment, but I do think they're cautiously optimistic. Some of that, I think, may be seen in the play that the Democratic leadership made earlier this week with helping out Mike Johnson sort of,
Stay in office.
Stay in office. It's like someone has to be the grown up in the room. We need to govern, that sort of thing. So I do think there's confidence, but there's not cockiness like we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
So, Mark, the same question as to Ron. Like, you've been in the room as a staffer to House Republicans in cycles where you're about to take over, cycles where you've padded your majority, and cycles where you've lost, right? What do you think, take us in their mindset right now, one seat majority and a lot of conflict internally?
Sure. We talked earlier about the big issues that might motivate Democrat, Republican voters. The economy, depending on how you slice it, we're on the same page in that way, right? Dobbs was an issue to the Democrats, and then sort of protection of democracy. On the Republican side, maybe it's public safety, immigration, the economy, and then to your point, Kevin, maybe it's culture war, right? When you look at the congressional map, I'm not sure if you've got an able candidate who's won before. I don't know how he or she cannot speak to those issues well and win a re-election. This is all to say, I'm not seeing a big trend or tidal wave that changes the map in such a way that you see a lot of Republicans washed out or a lot of Democrats ascending.
You don't see a wave election.
I really don't. What I see is, I think to Ron's point here is, this sort of resolves back to candidate quality and whether he or she can speak to matters of public concern or not. And if they can win, they can stay in office, or they can unseat somebody if they're a real competitor. So I think it's somewhat atomized. And there's another point I want to make here, which is within the Beltway, we're watching the House Republicans struggle mightily to manage their own affairs with just the difficulty of McCarthy taking the gavel in the first instance as Speaker and then being removed from it. All the questions about Mike Johnson's leadership, and sort of how all these big consequential decisions came to be stalled and ground to a halt. All that drama, one might be inclined to think, oh, this is going to hurt Republicans back in Alabama or Louisiana or Orange County. I'm not sure it breaks through. I don't know for sure, but I'm not sure it breaks through. And I think our shared view that highly motivated, quality candidate who can speak to matters of public concern, they blow right past this.
Yeah.
Kevin, as someone who ran in a swing competitive district every 2 years, I always tried to localize my election, what I was doing for the district and my connection to it, my deep roots, and personalize it and try to stay away from the noise at the federal level. But to Mark's point, this has been a very chaotic Congress, especially in the House. I mean, the majority deposed their own speaker for the first time in our nation's history. And Republican speakers know in order to get major things passed, they had to bring a bill to the floor that would require the vast majority of Democrats supporting it and a minority of Republicans support. Again, that's never happened really before in the history of our country, where the majority is basically ceding these bills to the minority, expecting them to carry it. And we've seen that time and time again. But to Mark's point, does this cut through? Do people pay that close attention to what's actually being done in good governance or not? I'm not so sure. And I think for a lot of these candidates in tough races, the more you can get away from Washington and just localize it and talk about the stuff you're working on back home, the better off you're going to be.
Can I ask Mark a quick question? And you too, Congressman. I know that there is some effort to, and I'm not going to name names here, punish some of the folks whom helped remove McCarthy from office. And by doing so, I mean creating this challenging primaries. Do you think any of that breaks through for the folks who are, because it gets to your point, Mark, about quality of candidates and their ability, as the congressman said, to be able to talk about what they have done at home. If they're viewed as this national figure that's creating chaos, does that create any challenges at all? I'm just curious.
I don't know, but what I can say is there is a real phenomenon where, particularly on the Republican side, there's a particular brand which is that some have embraced, and the incentives reward, which is I'm running against my leadership. My leadership is dumb, corrupt, stupid, or all three of those things.
And I can raise more money against them than with them.
Bingo, bingo. The ability to raise small dollar amounts is it's the sky's the limit, right?
Yeah.
And in these and there's an alternative media that provides fertile ground for these kinds of arguments. There's exasperation all over the place, and now there's a thing that you can light upon. Oh, you know what? It's corrupt. It's corrupt, dumb, or weak leadership. That's the reason. I don't know it breaks through. So there's a member of Congress from Virginia, Bob Good, chair of the Freedom Caucus now. There's some Republicans
He's got a
supporting
primary
a
opponent.
primary. Now, if he loses, will that change the makeup in the House? Probably not. It won't change it numerically, right? That's a
Yeah.
Republican seat.
Let me jump in on a couple of things here, and then we'll get to our last question for this segment. One, Ron, on your point, the most chaotic Congress in our lifetime, and this is a really tough needle for Republicans to thread, to say keeping us in the majority will be less chaotic and bring back President Trump, who was not exactly, the first word that isn't going to come out of people's mouth is stability about the Trump administration and how it handled a lot of its business. I agree with Mark. I don't see a wave right now. It's like a very small ripple effect, and don't see Republicans are at risk in California and New York, but they're balanced out in places like North Carolina where they're going to pick up several seats. So I agree. It's kind of a wash. What we think right now is that the House flips and the Senate flips. That'd be the first time in American history where a Congress controlled, each party controlled one chamber, and then the next Congress, they each had controlled the other chamber. Never before happened, right? It's kind of indicative of the unique times that we're in. I'm worried about the chaos in that if Republicans go in the minority, what's left is actually the more conservative element. It's the moderates who got washed out in New York and Illinois and California, places like that. I'm also worried that Ron said it's a lifetime to the election, and I see two big things. One, we're not talking enough about the debt. We're borrowing, a record amount of money at record interest rates. And two, if you look at history and all that's going on, like we're ripe for an act of domestic terrorism, whether or not it's caused by domestic actors or caused by a foreign actor. And then we don't know what happens, whether or not there's a rally around the flag and the incumbent effect that works to every incumbent's benefit, or if there's a throw the bums out, you didn't protect us moment here. So I want to wrap this segment by asking maybe the most important question, which is Sonia and Mark worked on the Hill for decades. Ron, you were in the House for 26 years. Talk about how the seeds of policy success for 2025 and 2026 are being planted now by people who are active and engaged, even as the election is gearing up.
Yeah, Kevin, it's so important to stay actively engaged, to be communicating, to have those lines of communication to the policymakers, especially now, even though it's an election year and there's some distraction out on the campaign trail. But it's that narrative you want to form early that sticks in offices, whether it's staff, whether it's the member themselves, that carry over into next year. And there's some big issues coming up next year on the healthcare front, on TCJA, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. There are a lot of expiring provisions. It'll give Congress a chance to really open up the tax code again in a meaningful way. And there are interests there that need to be protected or interests to be advanced. And this is the time to start telling that story, planting those seeds with the policymakers. And that's what we do. I mean, we've got those relationships on the Hill. We can anticipate who's going to be holding the gavel or who's going to be on the key committees. We can certainly foster those type of relationship buildings. And this is the perfect time to do it, rather than waiting until the last minute when policies can suddenly be sprung on you. And then it's too late for you to get your story out.
No, I think that's exactly right. And as former community staffers, and maybe Mark will agree with me on this, you're always thinking about not only what's in front of you right now to get through this next legislative work period or the end of the year, but also what's coming up next year as well. Those things that are not quite ripe for success this year, you got to go and educate folks to Ron's point. Education is key, having visibility to make sure folks understand that there is a need and a benefit, a public benefit to meeting your specific goals and cultivating those relationships now. It's just a perfect opportunity. Fortunately, Congress is not doing a lot right now in terms of moving legislation. So there's a lot of time now to talk to members, to talk to staff, just because it doesn't feel like things are operating in a normal way. Know that with congressional office, certainly with committee staff, they're taking meetings. They're talking to folks. They're trying to get a vision and an idea of what they want their most immediate legislative goals and calendar look like and what they're planning for ahead in the coming year.
I love what Sonia said here. When Congress, when things are aligned such that it's difficult to pass laws, whether it be closely divided Congress, an election year, difficulties with House leadership, this is an extraordinary opportunity for entities that care about public policy. They want an environment which they can compete and win. This is a great time to go in and talk. One principle that's important to think about is you may believe in your company, what you make, your culture, and you may be right. But unless and until you talk to policymaker, unless and until you talk to staff, you really don't know how your product or service actually sells or is thought about. You cannot imagine what those things are until you talk to them. And with the benefit of that feedback, you understand, oh, I'm not that well liked by so-and-so, or I have a risk here, or I have an opportunity here. Members and staff, this is something else to be thought about, are entrepreneurs. They're always looking for winning issues. And if it can't be 2024, it's going to be 2025. So to Sonia's point, this is the chance, this is when the iron's hot to both really understand how policymakers think about you, both good and bad, and to find winners, find champions.
And Kevin, I would just add that based on my communication with current members, my former colleagues, there's a lot of frustration on both sides that more isn't being done. And when that pent-up frustration continues to build, there's an explosion of activity then in the next Congress, early in the next Congress. So this is the time to be in there laying that groundwork, anticipating there's going to be a lot of energy just because of the frustration that most members are feeling today.
Ron, that's a great point. We all know that the first year of a White House, whether or not it's a incumbent reelected or in this case a former occupant coming back, will be the most productive of those 4 years, and a lot of things will get done. I wanted to just add one thought, which is we mentioned earlier, we're looking at a 51-49 or 52-48 Senate. We're looking at a House where if somebody's got a 15-seat majority, that's going to be a massive change from what we have, but it's likely to be smaller than that, right? So if you're not out test driving your ideas with people in the middle, the Ron Kynes of the world when he was in the House, the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, you don't know. If those people aren't picking up your ideas and embracing them, you're not going to be winning in 2025. So I think this is the time you go out, you test drive those ideas, you find the champions, and you move forward. So with that, if you've got questions on the politics, it's ron.kind@arnoldporter.com. It's Sonia Nesbitt at arnoldporter.com, mark.epley at arnoldporter.com, or kevin.o'neill at arnoldporter.com. All right, so great conversation there on politics and the 2024 election. Let's transition to talk about something a little more wonky, tax policy. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the signature accomplishment of the Trump presidency on the domestic policy side, and a lot of those provisions due to expire in 2025. So today we want to talk about what's in it, what's it mean for my business or sector of the economy, and what do I do about it to get ready for the big battle ahead. So, Ron, I'll start with you. You were in the room. Some of these provisions are, things you fought for and fought against. Tell us about the major elements of what's there and what you think each party's mindset is as we approach reauthorization.
Yeah, the TCJA was passed in 2017, and for budgetary reasons and in order to make it add up correctly, there are a lot of expiring provisions that's going to come to a head next year. So it's going to give Congress an opportunity to really open up the tax code in a significant way. Now, when they passed the original legislation, they had across the board some marginal tax rates, significant reduction in the corporate rate, reduction in pass-through rates too for all the S corporations out there as well. But they also had issues that they took away from corporations, from expensing to R&D. That was supposed to get taken care of this year with a bipartisan package that doesn't look like it's going to reach the finish line. So that's going to carry over into next year. So all this is going to be fair game for Congress to take a look at. And the thing to remember now is there's been tremendous turnover in the House Ways and Means Committee, my former committee, where I think about a majority of the members now weren't around for that debate in 2017. So a lot of this is...
And even more change coming after this election.
And a lot more change probably happening and turnover on the key committees of jurisdiction. And so, again, laying that narrative now in regards to interests you want to protect or interests you want to advance has to start now. And the current chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith, has set up these task forces, these bipartisan working groups on various sections of the tax code, understanding who the people are involved in that section of the code, getting in front of them with your issues and with your story. That's starting to happen already with these task forces being created. So clearly Congress isn't waiting until the last minute. They're already trying to lay the groundwork this year, anticipating the heavy lifting and the real work that has to go into next year already.
So, Ron, I want to stay with you on this next question and loop Sonia in. We talked in our earlier segment of the podcast about the chances, you put it in the high 50s, of Democrats retaking the House in this election. So if Democrats retake the House and Richie Neal becomes chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, what are his biggest priorities for TCJA? And then we're going to ask Mark the opposite.
Again, it's going to depend on who's the occupant in the White House, where the tax debate and discussion is going to go and what the framework will be that they're operating under. But I don't think any member is going to want to support the expiration of the marginal tax rates. That would just affect too many working families, not politically smart to do that. So that's a huge chunk of what they need to fix next year. And it's also very expensive, which makes it dangerous too, because if there's an attempt to pay for a lot of these expiring provisions, that could get expensive and that could come out of someone else's hide. So there's a saying, you don't want to be on the plate when you should be at the table. That's involved right. In the discussions. So again, that's the type of information that members need to hear now, so you don't end up being part of the pay for or what they're going to use to protect.
At the table or on the menu might be like the every lobbyist's favorite tattoo, right?
Yeah,
so that's their mantra. Okay, so you see that marginal tax rates sort of form the reason du jour for either party to get a bill across the finish line. Sonia, what else would you see as sort of the major Democratic priorities if they own the House and maybe they have the trifecta, or more likely they just have the White House and they don't have the Senate?
They're obviously going to push for the child tax credit refundability piece. That was very key for most Democrats. It's something that a number of them advocated very strongly on. They've obviously had a great deal of conversations with Ways and Means Chair Jason Smith on this. Obviously, didn't get what they wanted there, but that's something that a provision that they feel very strongly about, given what they believe to be the implications it had on reducing child poverty, putting money back in the hands of folks who are struggling to make ends meet. Getting back to this economy is good for even those folks who are at the lower margins, unfortunately, economically in our society. So I foresee that to be sort of their main thing that they really are going to drive towards in their druthers if they are somewhat in control of their fate there. And to Ron's point, I mean, you can't really go back on those marginal tax rates. I mean, once that bill came out, it was 2019, forget me. Most of us in this room knew, well, those are going to be here to stay. You don't give people something and then take it back, right? It's just too hard to do. And there'll be other things on periphery as well, particularly related to pass-through rates, corporate tax, those kind of things. But I don't see anything big? Those are hard questions, right, to deal with. And then, of course, there's SALT, which may be more of an
State
issue.
and local
State
taxation.
and
Yeah,
local
if you're
tax.
from California, Illinois,
New
New
York.
Jersey, New York,
Yes.
Washington, you know that you know what SALT is, and
Exactly.
you know how much it's hurting you.
Right, but neither party, and when I think about party, I'm thinking about president and the White House has been able to figure out how to come to a deal. And maybe, certainly Ron can tell us a little bit more about how those conversations went, but it seems to be a challenge for every party who's in control.
So I do want to get to the Republican side of the priority list here in a minute, but I want to ask you guys one more question, which is, so we've talked about what they really want. Democrats, should they have the control of the process here? What did they dislike most about TCGA? What are the things that if they could get the goods and throw out the bad of that, they when they're in control, they would really try and do? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, I think there was some controversy for how low the corporate rate ultimately went. It was certainly much more than what the Democrats were comfortable with. But once it gets baked into Sonia's point, it's awfully tough to roll that back again at some point. You mix in it what's happening with the international tax regime right now, too, and the discussions taking place there. And there might be some things that they're going to have to work on in the code to harmonize if they want to maintain control, rather than ceding it just the OECD countries to dictate what global tax rules will be. So that's something, too, that they're going to have to dive into. But this will be some really heavy lifting. But it's also a great opportunity to not only protect interests, but to advance certain interests that you have in the tax code. And again, that work has to start early on, rather than waiting until the last minute. Because I know these packages are big. Usually the offsets come at the last minute, so it doesn't give opposition a chance to mobilize. And that's why it's important to do the work earlier rather than waiting on it.
Sonia, do you have any other thoughts of things Dems don't want, they would love to push out of the reauthorization?
No, I think Ron hit it really nicely, particularly on the corporate tax rate. Again, I think there was a general consensus, and please, Ron, correct me if I'm wrong here, among even the Democrats, that the corporate tax rate prior to TGC, the tax bill being done, was too high. Now I feel like it's too low, and so finding that sweet spot, to your point, would be a bit of a challenge. But is it enough to overtake, to be kicked out? I don't know. I just don't know.
Of course, if we're looking at a Biden second term, he's vowed not to raise taxes on anyone earning $400,000 or less. And I think they'll try to stay true to that with the Treasury team that he has in place. But President Trump, if we do have another Trump administration, he's going to do what he can to protect the current tax code without major changes. But he's going to go after tariffs. He's vowing to have 10% across the board tariffs, which does raise revenue, but it's a hidden tax on American businesses and American consumers that pay that tariff rate. And he'll even be tougher on China with a potential 60% tariff rate, which would be a huge supply chain disruption, perhaps inflationary, and again, a hidden tax on the American consumer.
So, Mark, that's a great transition to talk to you a little bit about the Republican priorities. So we'll start off with the assumption that maybe Republicans hold the House, or they win the White House, but they have some say in the matter. They more likely flip the Senate in what the next tax bill looks like. So what are their TCJA priorities?
So just to step back just a moment to think about what was it that Republicans were trying to accomplish with the TCJA. The view going into it was that the corporate rate was too high, and that U.S. corporations, all the incentives were aligned for U.S. corporations to create entities abroad to realize gains abroad in lower tax jurisdictions. So the thought was, one, there's a need to lower the corporate tax rate, and there's also some need to do some changes on the international side so that their incentives will be for U.S. corporations, particularly multinational corporations, to have operations and to realize gains here in the United States.
And that's worked, right? Because we no longer use the phrase repatriate our tax dollars since that happened, right?
That's right. I think that this was acknowledged on both sides of the aisle, that the incentives were for U.S. multinational corporations to realize taxes abroad in lower tax jurisdictions. The remedy was differently thought of. So, for example, right now we're talking about an agreement among the OECD countries, this Pillar 2, let's create a minimum tax to avoid the sort of flight to lower tax jurisdictions. So one thing to be remedied was the corporate tax rate. So by lowering the corporate tax rate, which by the way is permanent in TCJA, I think the thought was we can't just do a corporate tax rate. Frankly, the politics are bad of that. Now, I think the motivation was righteous in the sense that the view was it's going to be more U.S. jobs and the U.S. Treasury is going to realize more revenue in the long term. But it needed to be paired up as a political matter with individual tax cuts. So the individual rates were cut, but that's temporary. Those are the things that expire in 2025. Congressman Kine mentioned the marginal tax rate. One of the things that it doubled the standard deduction. That also expires in 2025. So there's, and Sonia mentioned the refundable child tax credit, which means you get a check if you qualify. So the things that affect individual families, those things are temporary and they'll go away in 2025. Another piece that goes away in 2025 is the treatment of pass-through entities, these S corps. So it used to be the case if you had an individual tax rate that was 39.6, right, and you had a corporate rate that was 35%. If you're a pass-through entity, you sort of file taxes as if you're an individual, right? Your business entity does. Let's imagine a family-owned business. It can be a very large business that distributes beverages around the country, for example. They might be an S corp, not a C corp. At that point, those rates are relatively close, right? But when you drop the corporate rate from 35 to 21, you need to do something on the pass-through entity side. So Congress came up with this scheme. This is called 199 Cap A, and the idea was we're going to qualified business income. We're going to tax that at 20%. We're at a lower rate to somehow kind of equalize these things.
So the practical effect of that is to help the mom and pop operation compared to the Fortune 500
That's
operation.
Right. But when this individual or this provision for pass-through entities snaps back in 2025, meaning goes away, and you're back to an individual rate of 39.6 plus, it's going to create some really interesting dynamics, and could be the incentive that Congress needs to do something to extend some of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Right now within Congress, there's far less. If there were a Republican bent toward corporate America, public companies at one time, Wall Street, that's gone away. I noticed this sort of after the 2008 collapse. Republican interest in sort of protecting those things without something more to commend it has gone away. So the mom and pops, Kevin, even the big mom and pops, that's a lot more attractive politically to Republicans.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that because I was going to ask about that, Mark. It's not even since 2008. It's definitely Trump era where the Rob Portmans of the world being replaced with populists like J.D. Vance, where in Ohio, a senator, where you have a lot less tolerance for corporations altogether, right? So we mentioned earlier, culture war is a potential hot issue for Republicans in the election. And I think a lot of Republican senators and House members feel like corporations have started participating in the culture war, pro or con, and they want them out of that. And they no longer have the tolerance to just reflexively do whatever the hometown executive of a major corporation asks them to do in the tax code. And I'm wondering, what do you think that means? I'm asking Sonia and I'm asking Mark as staffers who dealt with this in the committees for years and years. How do you think that shapes the TCGA fight?
Well, to the extent there's a culture war issues that break through and motivate policymakers, motivate voters, there isn't a worry about woke mom and pop businesses.
Great point.
That's a fair point. And some of those mom and pop businesses are not just, there's variety in all of them. I mean, in fact, in the healthcare space, some of those are there's clinics and other practices that are owned by healthcare providers. So a variety of people who are going to be impacted and who will weigh in with their members. I think on the Democratic side, obviously the cultural war isn't there, at least not on the woke part. And I use air quotes for that. But from a former staffer perspective, I mean, you deal with it in that you're thinking very locally about how it impacts your constituency, your community, and you're responding in that way. So it can break through in a very positive way if it's localized to how it impacts the community. Something I could break through maybe, Mark, on this, and Kevin, on this bent towards populism too, because at the end of the day, you're right, there is a shift towards populism, which I thought in my lifetime, perhaps young lifetime, I'd never see. But there still needs to be a response, I think, as an elected official to the people who vote you into office.
So, Mark, I asked Ron and Sonia this earlier, so I want to ask you the same. Were there things that President Trump and House Republicans left on the table in TCJA that they'd like to revisit and try and win this time around, in addition to just keeping what's there going forward?
So I think that the design of the TCAJ really accomplished what the sponsors set out to do, which was to make U.S. corporations, create incentives that U.S. corporations keep jobs in America and realize gains in America. So I'm not sure whether there's a view of we got half a loaf, we're going to go get the whole loaf. I think the way to think about this is, well, it's to go back to sort of the pass through the mom and pops. Sonia, the limited the partnerships. So you have healthcare entities and partners practices. They're not C corps. They organize as an S corp. They pay taxes that way.
Right.
So I guess, Kevin, I'm stuck by that question because I'm not sure. I'm fixated on how cataclysmic this undoing is going to be, and I'm not sure I can go back to what more of the loaf we could have gotten. I think what's certainly true is this is a dynamic, and it's not limited to TCJA. There's other provisions that are expiring on or about 2025, and this dynamic environment is one in which any entity that's affected by the tax code, particularly by expiring provisions, this is an opportunity to get in early, because in this dynamic environment, we don't know how it'll turn out, but we know that those who are engaged, talking to policymakers early and often, you'll find a way. Right now, the NHL playoffs are starting, and there's no easy way to get the puck in the goal, but sort of a relentlessness on the part of the offense. You'll find a way, right?
So, so you're not sure what they may have left on the table. So let me ask. Sonia's mentioned child care. We've talked about corporate rates. We've talked about personal rates. Two areas, maybe just a personal interest, is retirement savings and college savings. Those are two big buckets. And are there risks and rewards in the TCJA fight to come for either of those sectors? Sonia, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, that's a great question. I would have to defer to Ron. I mean, I think there's a great deal of popularity in a bipartisan way for obviously 529s and retirement savings plans. So any risk of their undoing, I think, would be premature at best.
Although you've got some populists who say that retirement plans in particular really favor the well-off as opposed to the people who most need to be saving.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, those plans are also a vehicle, I think, along moderate Democrats, not speaking for all of them, could be viewed as a way to also build economic wealth that wasn't already there in the family, right? So it's yes, there's that populist view too, but again, I think that overall, particularly given the vast number of Americans who are in these plans right now, I think it would be difficult, at least from my perspective, to pull them back much. But what I would say, though, is build a little bit off what Mark talked about, is that one of the challenges I think with TCJA is that, look, I mean, it was a very broad bill that touched on a variety of things that I think, you tell me, Mark and Kevin, I mean, if you look at the recent attempt from Ways and Means Chair Jason Smith and his ranking member Richard Neal, to get some sort of pared down package that extends some of these provisions through the House and through the Senate. I think that demonstrates, at least talking with a Democratic member, at least, and this is using their words, not mine, was it the bill that they wanted? No. But yet it demonstrated that there is some bipartisan interest in moving forward with certain things. And so no progress, limited progress, was better than no progress at all on these items. So I just say all that to say that, again, there are lots of things in that big package that Democrats don't have a lot to love, right? But there are certain things that they can see the added value and benefit of, particularly for their folks, that they're like, you know what? If we can get some particular movement, why not do it? And I don't know how that bodes for any future debates as it relates to, let's say you end up with a Democratic House, Kevin, all taxes start in the House, Republican Senate, and a Democratic White House. What happens there? But decisions certainly need to be made by the end of this year.
Yeah. So let me, Ron mentioned earlier that Chairman Smith has just formed these 10 working groups. I feel like this is a blueprint that has been used before in Ways and Means leading up to big tax packages, or even just in the Republican conference in particular, where they have a concept and they throw together some working groups. Tell us a little bit about those working groups, and then maybe transition to how if you're a client, whether or not you're that mom and pop business that's grown into 7 states and you have significant needs, or you're a corporate 2000 entity and you've got bigger, more global needs, like how should you be interacting with those working groups? Are they meaningful or not at this stage?
Right. So this has been used before. Former Ways and Means Chairman Dave Camp had working groups. They were actually bipartisan.
Right. Right.
And so one of the things to keep in mind about changes to the tax code is it's super complicated. And members of Congress, they don't do tax policy day to day or do tax planning day to day. It's the kind of thing where it's necessary on a continual basis to sort of bring members back up to a state of knowledge where they're able to talk about tax law changes in a way that is accessible to everyone, to go to the public square and explain, hey, this tax law ought to be changed, and here's why. It's a very difficult task. It can't be done without the benefit of member education. And this is a long tradition at Ways and Means Committee, in particular. True at Senate Finance, one of the things Sonia and I are both alumni of Ways and Means. We're very proud of that. One curiosity is when Ways and Means marks up the tax code, they actually mark up the tax code, meaning we're going to change 199 Cap A. There shall be a 199 Cap A, and there'll be a new subsection A, and it will do these things. The Senate Finance Committee, they do it in narrative form, meaning
it's like conceptual.
They write out, there'll be a tax that increases such and such and does this, or deduction.
Details to come later.
Right. This is a point of pride on both the Democrat and Republican side, is that we spend hours in this member education so that we can talk about matters of public concern, make a case for it, and pass law on that. So that's a long way of saying, for background, this has been done before. It's hugely consequential, and clients absolutely should be in talking to them right now more than ever, because it's still just an idea. Right, 2024 is still just an idea. What are we going to do next Congress? If you come with a concrete idea about how a tax law ought to be preserved or changed, this is something that policymakers and staff can latch onto. And we've talked about in the other part of our conversation, more generally, you do not know what sells and what doesn't sell until you talk to policymakers and staff.
That's right. Can I just jump in and point out that particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, a lot of those members who have been added to the committee since they took the majority weren't on the committee in 2019, right? And so
most are. And Sonia, I'm sorry I didn't even mention this. If you look at this, if you look at the map, and Kevin, you're always want to point this out. Most of the members on the Republican side weren't around when the TCJA was passed. Really, really excellent point.
Which means they're also not invested necessarily in keeping a provision. They don't feel strongly about it, connected to it, right, unless it affects their district.
And they need to understand how it might impact their district. To Mark's great point, education is key. And talking to both sides. So you're right. The former chair Dave Camp, the working groups are bipartisan. These are not, but that doesn't mean that Democrats obviously aren't engaged as well. So I think also key for folks, to Mark's point, is that education piece on the Republican side, but the Democrats as well. I mean, you get a long way by going out of your way not to talk to just one office, right? You need to educate everyone, particularly on tax issues, because they're so complicated. And yes, there's a lot of jostling that happens in the committee, but there needs to be a wide understanding of its broader implications. Because to Mark's great point, unlike the Senate Finance Committee, we don't have those conceptual markups where details are to come later. We'll figure it out perhaps 6 months later. We want to know the impact right now. And you have to vote in that markup on whether or not you want to proceed or pull back on a specific provision. So education is very key.
Ron made the point earlier that you're either at the table or on the menu, and he also made the point that the offsets, the things that are used to pay for this bill, come very late in the process, deliberately to keep people from being able to push back against them in the House. And to your points about what clients should be doing, if you're at the table talking to people, that's when you actually hear, oh, so-and-so has this bright idea of eating your lunch to pay for his lunch, right? And it's like, oh, I need to be playing defense as well as offense. But if you're not out playing offense, it's often hard to know that you should be playing defense on a big thing like this. I want to make one more comment, and then we'll wrap up your final thoughts here on TCGA, which is that when this passed the recent Congress, economic times were good, and nobody was really arguing, are they good or not, right? We were in the times of easy money, practically, zero interest loans and stuff like that. And here we are in May, the Fed's not looking like they're going to have any of the reductions that they thought. And next year, we're very unsettled about is the economy. Earlier, Sonia was arguing the economy is really good. We just haven't convinced people of that. Republicans would argue the economy's not very good. It needs to get better. That's actually a really tough time to change the tax code. And then Mark mentioned several points here that there's a lot of things expiring, and this Congress is not good at doing things fast and on time. So I want to get your sort of wrap up with your maybe doom and gloom things of like, what could go wrong here? Like, could things expire before they actually get to the finish line on this, or they could have a short-term extension? And how does bad economy versus good economy shape what the final product looks like?
Sure. I mean, I think to answer one of your last questions, I think we've seen time and again, yes, these provisions can expire at the end of the year, but the Ways and Means Committee, Senate Finance Committee they have I think a small window of which they can go back in the beginning of the year and make certain changes retroactively. So December 31st is the magic date, but there's still a little bit of a wiggle room there. But look, yeah, absolutely, the things that can dictate how badly things go or how great things can go be dictated by the election. I mean, it depends on who is in the White House next year. And that's going to motivate them a great deal in terms of their interventions or their response to the economy. So things going terribly wrong, I think, would be a scenario where, Democrats perhaps I wouldn't say terribly wrong. Let me revise my words here. Things that could be very challenging would be a scenario where you could see Democrats take a very narrow control of the House chamber, lose the Senate, and lose the White House. How do you then, as if you are the great Richard Neal, come to an agreement with the Republican side that's going to be able to appease many of the desires of your vast and diverse caucus that's going to range from those who are a little bit more sort of business-centric in the Democratic side to those who just let it all expire and let the chips fall where they may on the progressive side.
Mark?
So back to the sort of NHL playoff, it's a dynamic environment and anything can happen. It's actually really exciting opportunity to wade in this public policy conversation and find opportunities for for clients. What's really interesting is that, look, if Democrats come to take the House, the Senate, and the White House, you have to imagine the corporate rates going up, right? From 21 to something, maybe.
Yeah,
Right.
marginally.
A hard sell, but it's something they can use to pay for a lot of other wish list items.
Right. If nothing's done, one of the things President Biden's made a important priority, Democrats have made, is we don't want to raise taxes on people making less than $400,000. And if the TCGA provisions expire for the individual, taxes are going to go up because the standard deduction is going to be cut in half right away. The child tax credit's already gone away in large measure. So those are dynamics. There's enough pain there that creates opportunity, right? That we have to have a fix, and out of a fix, you have to have a deal, right? And so there's a compromise of some kind that could arise from it. Kevin, I have to. You mentioned pay-fors. What's curious is, often the pay-for is just paying, but people try to make tax policy through the pay-for as well. I'll give you an example, and interesting to think about it. So there is concern about the affordability of housing for people to buy, but also to rent, right? Mm-hmm. And there's an idea out there that would sort of take away the ordinary tax benefits that come from business that own lots of rental property, single family rental property, that would take this away. This is something that I think Chairman Wyden at Senate Finance Committee is on this kind of bill. This, were this to become law, it would make it uneconomic for large companies or large entities to own lots of rental property, and it would change that market pretty significantly. There are lots of other things, Kevin, that could change, but just to the point that the pay-fors aren't always just paying. There's sometimes an effort to change incentives and change the marketplace. So in this dynamic environment, those kinds of things could happen.
Yeah. So I'll end with this on the client front. In tax reauthorization, as is true in any space, if you're expecting to pick up the paper one day and discover that Congress has done you a tremendous favor that's going to improve your business, you are sorely mistaken. That's not how this is work. You're much more likely to pick up the paper and discover that they have done something, either consciously or unconsciously, that destroys or undermines a big part of your future business environment. That's why you need to be active. So great conversation today about TCJA reauthorization. If you want more information, it's mark.epley at arnoldporter.com, sonia.nesbitt at arnoldporter.com, ron.kind at arnoldporter.com, or kevin.o'neill at arnoldporter.com. Thanks for joining us for the May episode of Advocacy and Policy here at Arnold & Porter. We'll see you next month.